Jersey Joe Walcott is a true artist in the boxing ring. A defensive wizard with beautifully smooth footwork, he would win the heavyweight title at 37 years of age. Walcott had it tough for the most part of his career, earning no money whatsoever while supporting his family for most of it. On his way to the heavyweight title, he was consistently facing tough opposition, winning and losing. In 1947, he would score both wins and losses to Hall of Famers Elmer Ray and Joey Maxim. He would challenge Joe Lewis towards the end of his dominant title reign and would put on one of his greatest performances, dropping Lewis twice but was robbed of a decision. Lewis would subsequently win the rematch via a brutal knockout, and Walcott would next start his epic four-fight rivalry with the legendary Ezzard Charles. Charles, who was widely regarded as the greatest light heavyweight ever, had moved up to win the heavyweight title and would defeat Walcott in their first two encounters. But in their third fight, Walcott would pull off potentially the greatest ever punch to win the heavyweight title, with a smooth left uppercut that knocked Charles out cold. And in his final defence, after dropping the unbeaten challenger Rocky Marciano, being up on the cards in the 13th round, he would get caught with one of the most iconic knockouts of all time. He would retire with a record of 49 wins to 21 losses and 1 draw with 31 KOs. Ken Norton was the former WBC heavyweight champion of the world. A swarming power puncher who used a cross guard and worked both body and head effectively, he would be the second man to defeat Muhammad Ali, breaking his jaw in the process. He would give Muhammad Ali all kinds of problems in their trilogy, effectively battering Ali to both body and head, but only getting the result in one of the 3 bouts. Another one of Norton's career highlights was his brutal all-time classic fights against the brilliant Larry Holmes. Holmes and Norton would produce the most exciting and grueling round 15 ever seen in boxing history. He would defeat lots of the top contenders across a stacked era of 70s heavyweights, with notable victories over the likes of Muhammad Ali, Jerry Quarry, Jimmy Young and Tex Cobb. He would also step in with some of the most brutal punches of the era, being on the wrong end of some devastating knockouts against the likes of George Foreman, Jerry Quarry and Ernie Shavers. He would eventually retire from boxing with a record of 42 wins, 7 losses, 1 draw and 33 knockouts. Riddick Bowe was one of the most talented heavyweights of all time. A big man who had incredible heart, who could outbox you or outfight you on the inside. Bowe could do it all, and there's not a heavyweight in history that would have an easy night against him in his prime. Bowe was full of hunger and desire on his way to the heavyweight title, beating a whole bunch of contenders such as Pierre Kurtzer, Tony Tubbs, Tyrell Biggs, Burt Cooper and Pinklon Thomas. He would eventually get a shot at a heavyweight title against Evander Holyfield, and the pair would put on one of the greatest heavyweight fights of all time. Both Holyfield and Bowe would show incredible guts and determination in what was an all-time classic, and it would spark the beginning of their epic trilogy. In some of the most action-packed rounds ever seen in the heavyweight division, Bowe would win the first fight. He would lose the second fight to Holyfield and would win the third, knocking Holyfield out with a right hand. Their trilogy is regarded as one of the best ever. Although his prime years didn't last as long as some people expected him to, it's worth noting how good he was in his prime. A real all-rounder who showed us against one of the all-time greats that he had the skill, power, toughness and heart to be classed as one of the greats. His career was filled with bizarre incidents, like his 2 fights with Andrew Golota, where Golota continuously hit him below the belt and was disqualified in both fights, causing a riot in the ring. And of course, one of the most random incidents ever seen, when a fan parachute jumped into the ring. Bowe would also defeat Herbie Hyde for the WBO heavyweight title. Riddick Bowe was a great fighter who always brought entertainment to his fights. He retired with a record of 43 wins, 1 loss and 33 knockouts. Floyd Patterson was the original youngest heavyweight champion of the world and another protege of the legendary Cus D'Amato. Blessed with some of the fastest hands ever seen in the heavyweight division, he used to beautifully throw combination punches together from the peekaboo stance. Patterson was relatively small for a heavyweight, but would still knock out the legendary Archie Moore at the age of just 21 to win the title. He would make 4 defences of the heavyweight crown before being knocked out by Sweden's Ingemar Johansson. Johansson would drop Patterson 7 times in their heavyweight bout, but this defeat would give Patterson a chance to make history, becoming the first man in boxing history to regain the heavyweight title, knocking Johansson out with his iconic left hook, the Gazelle Punch. He would defeat Johansson in the third fight of their trilogy, as well as scoring wins against the likes of George Savallo, Archie Moore, Henry Cooper and Brian London. He would lose the heavyweight title in brutal fashion, getting stopped in both fights in the first round against the fearsome Sonny Liston. During the later stages of his career, he would also step in with Muhammad Ali twice, Jerry Quarry twice, Jimmy Ellis, and would score a win against Oscar Bonavena. He would retire standing at 6'7" with an awkward yet effective style, a solid chin and incredible power. Vitali Klitschko was a formidable opponent for anybody. His standout performance was actually one of his few defeats against Lennox Lewis in what was an all-time great heavyweight classic. Stylistically, he was a brutal outside fighter who liked to punish his opponents with spiteful shots. He was very good defensively and was extremely hard to work out. He would throw shots from all different kinds of angles. Due to his technique, size, power and chin, I think he gives any heavyweight in history a tough night. I feel like I should rank Vitali higher in this list, however I don't think he has a standout victory due to the era that he boxed in. And after knocking out Danny Williams, he also spent 4 years of his prime out of the ring. However, Vitali is undoubtedly a great fighter and one of the most dominant champions in the modern era. He would score wins over Herbie Hyde, Corey Sanders, Samuel Peter, Derek Chisora, Shannon Briggs and Thomas Adamek. In his 47 fights as a professional, he was never dropped and would retire with a record of 45 wins, 2 defeats with 41 knockouts. I don't normally rank current fighters on my top 20 lists unless they've done extraordinary things, as it's hard to compare someone whose career isn't finished against an all-time great who's finished their career. But Tyson Fury falls into that category, and there's no doubt by the end of his career he'll be higher on this list. The greatest heavyweight of this era, who's already cemented himself as a boxing legend, Fury would give any heavyweight in history fits. He's 6'9", can box from both orthodox and southpaw, extremely elusive on the outside, but also knows how to use his size to wear his opponents down up close. He has tremendous heart, and when you do hit him and even knock him down, he always gets back up and finds a way to win. So far in his career, Fury's had 6 heavyweight world title fights, claiming the title after dethroning the dominant Wladimir Klitschko. With hindsight, many people seem to forget that Fury was actually an underdog going into the Klitschko fight, but he used an awkward yet effective style to outpoint the dominant champion over 12 rounds in dominant fashion. He's also been involved in an epic rivalry against the most dangerous heavyweight on the planet, Deontay Wilder. I'll never forget the moment I watched Fury rise off the canvas in that 12th round after being hit by the hardest puncher in boxing today. But he showed his excellent boxing brain, adjusting in the rematch and walking Wilder down to knock him out, as well as showing tremendous courage and heart in their third and final fight, climbing off the canvas multiple times to secure a brutal knockout. As champion, he's also got a good win against Dillian Whyte, and 3 wins against Derek Chisora. As Fury continues his career at the top, he's no doubt going to beat more top names and cement himself as an all-time great heavyweight. And a fight with Alexander Usyk will crown an undisputed heavyweight champion. Ezzard Charles is widely regarded as the greatest light heavyweight in history, despite the fact that he never actually won the light heavyweight title. However, he would defeat the light heavyweight champion Joey Maxim 4 times and the legendary longest reigning light heavyweight champion Archie Moore 3 times. Charles would compete from middleweight to heavyweight, defeating multiple Hall of Famers and racking up one of the most impressive resumes in boxing history. Early in his career, he scored 2 wins against one of the most dangerous and avoided fighters in all time in Charlie Burley. He also defeated the likes of Jimmy Bivens and the legendary heavyweight champion Joe Louis. His 2 wins against heavyweight champion Jersey Joe Walcott would see him winning the heavyweight title, and he also gave Rocky Marciano one of his toughest fights. Technically, he was one of the smoothest boxers you'll ever see, one of the greatest counter-punchers of all time, defensively sound, with concussive power in both hands to body and head. Charles is one of the greatest and most underappreciated fighters in history. Gene Tunney was a boxing genius, decades ahead of his time, and one of the most underrated heavyweight champions in history. More of a thinking fighter, as opposed to the incredibly popular champion Jack Dempsey that he took the throne from. Tunney wasn't very well received with boxing fans at the time, maybe because of instead of bludgeoning his opponents, he preferred to use his skillful footwork, excellent defence and reflexes to outbox his opponents. In the 1920s, heavyweights just didn't move like this. In fact, the only fighter of that era that I can compare Tunney's movement to is Benny Leonard. Leonard was a pure boxing genius and is ranked as the greatest lightweight of all time alongside Roberto Duran. He was also a stablemate of Gene and taught Tunney a lot of his moves. In a way, Tunney revolutionised the way heavyweights boxed. The way he would put combination punches together, get in and out of range and find ways to escape was nothing short of genius, especially as it had never been done with such quality before. But his skills aren't the only thing that make him so great. He also has a legendary resume. His official record is 65 wins to 1 loss with 48 knockouts, but if you take newspaper contests into this, he's 85-1. His only career defeat came to arguably the greatest fighter of all time in Harry Greb, and he would avenge that defeat, beating Greb 3 times. He'd also have top heavyweight wins against George Carpentier and Tommy Gibbons, but most iconically, he had 2 clear wins against Jack Dempsey, in which he won the heavyweight title and defended it. Wladimir Klitschko is one of the most dominant heavyweights of all time. Statistically, he should be at the very top of this list. Reigning as heavyweight champion for 12 years, which is the longest ever, even longer than Joe Louis's, and making 23 title defences, Wladimir Klitschko is a legend. Wladimir showed vulnerability early on in his world title reign, getting stopped a few times, but after teaming up with Emanuel Stewart, the pair developed a winning formula that was as consistent as anyone in history. A giant of a heavyweight who had a great jab and one of the most destructive right hands in the division's history, and a powerful left hook, Wladimir was extremely strong, technical and tactical. It's also worth noting that he's an Olympic gold medalist. Similarly to his brother Vitali on this list, he wasn't in the greatest era during his prime. However, he was much more consistent and has some standout victories on his resume. Wladimir has wins over David Haye, an undefeated Alexander Povetkin and Kubrat Pulev, Samuel Peter, Chris Bird and Bryant Jennings, amongst many others. In my opinion, he also enhanced his legacy with a losing effort against Anthony Joshua. Many fans had accused Klitschko of being too boring, but in that fight he produced an all-time heavyweight classic and showed his heart against a much younger man. He would also show courage in a very entertaining fight against Samuel Peter, climbing off the canvas multiple times to win. He would retire with a record of 64 wins to 5 defeats and 53 knockouts, and his record as longest reigning heavyweight champion will take a long time if anyone will ever beat it. Mike Tyson is amongst the most talented heavyweights ever seen in the sport's history. Blessed with some of the fastest hands and most powerful punches ever seen, coincided with a brilliant defence and a solid chin, and one of the most intimidating auras ever seen. Iron Mike's impact on the sport is almost unprecedented. He was the biggest draw in all of sports in the late 80s and early 90s. One of the most dangerous fighters in history, Mike would demolish a string of contenders on his way to the heavyweight title. He would become the youngest heavyweight champion in history at 20 years old. In his prime, Tyson was seemingly invincible and strung together 9 consecutive title defences. Tyson was unleashing brutal, iconic knockouts time after time, terrifying his opponents before they even stepped into the ring with him. With the support of Cus D'Amato, Kevin Rooney and his manager Jim Jacobs, Mike was disciplined and the greatest heavyweight on the planet. But after the death of D'Amato and losing his team, the leeches would come in and exploit his career and Mike would go off the rails. Just 3 years into his reign, he would suffer a huge upset defeat to Buster Douglas. He would bounce back with some very good victories, but would then spend 5 years of his prime out of the ring. He scored a very good win to regain the heavyweight title, but ultimately lost against the greats of the era in Lewis and Holyfield. It's a shame how many leeches exploited Mike Tyson in his career and how we never got to see his full potential. But it's important to remember just how special that talent was in his prime years, destroying a string of top-level fighters and having the entire world watching his fights, expecting the next devastating knockout. He retired with a record of 50 wins, 6 losses and 44 KOs. Sonny Liston was a mountain of a man and the most intimidating fighter in history.
No one's more intimidating than Sonny Liston, not even myself.
Liston was a savage, with quite possibly the most violent jab in boxing history, which he used to use as a battering ram to smash his opponents with. Liston had a terrible childhood, and his abusive father would whip him so severely that the scars would still be visible decades later. Liston would turn to a life of crime and would become a mob enforcer, which made that intimidating aura that much scarier. In the ring, he was just a wrecking ball and was destroying top contenders time after time. Liston would storm through a whole list of top 10 ranked contenders on his way to the title, and going into his title fight with Floyd Patterson, winning 11 of his last 12 bouts by knockout. Patterson was no match for the much bigger, fearsome Sonny Liston, and he destroyed Patterson in the first round to claim the title. He would also rematch him in his first defence and score another brutal first round knockout against the former champ. With a record of 35-1 and the heavyweight champion of the world, Liston had brutalised all of the top fighters he'd been in with. Then he would defend the title against a young, unproven fighter called Cassius Clay. Nobody thought a young Muhammad Ali stood a chance against this fearsome champion, and everyone thought he was an unproven loudmouth. But he would dazzle Liston in the first fight and completely outbox him before Liston retired in the corner. Ali would win the rematch in the first round with one of the most iconic and controversial knockouts in boxing history. It will never be known whether Liston threw that second fight due to his affiliation with the mob. He retired with a record of 50-4 with 39 knockouts. Throughout the history of boxing, there has never been a fighter that brought that same furious intensity as Jack Dempsey. This list is only covering heavyweights of the last 100 years, but I'm going to make an exception for Jack Dempsey, who was still fighting at the top level until 1927, so I will be including his prior bouts before 1923. Jack Dempsey would simply demolish people. He revitalised boxing in the 1920s and is the reason fights were televised live on radio. He also was the first boxer to generate $1 million gate, smashing that record and generating $1.8 million in his fight versus George Carpentier. Prior to winning the heavyweight title, Jack Dempsey was homeless and travelling around America on trains, fighting troublemakers in bars for money. He would demolish Jess Willard to win the heavyweight title, dropping him 7 times in the first round, breaking Willard's jaw, cheekbones, ribs and knocking out several of his teeth. He would also knock out Georges Carpentier, Louis Firpo, Jack Sharkey, Billy Misk, battling Levinsky amongst many others. His all-out action style captivated audiences all around the country, and that's why he was one of the most popular fighters of all time. He also produced iconic moves that most boxers still use to this day, most notably the Dempsey roll. He would live until the age of 87 years old and retire with a record of 64 wins to 6 defeats, 9 draws, with 53 brutal KOs. Evander Holyfield is a boxing legend, and after arguably becoming the greatest cruiserweight of all time, claiming the undisputed throne in that division, he would move up to heavyweight and be the only boxer in history to go undisputed in 2 different weight divisions. Holyfield has one of the all-time great heavyweight resumes, despite the fact that he started off as a cruiserweight. He scored a clear TKO victory against Mike Tyson, despite being a massive underdog in their first fight, defeated the huge punching George Foreman on his comeback in one of the most entertaining heavyweight fights of the decade, defeated heavyweight champions John Ruiz and Michael Moore, as well as Ray Mercer and former heavyweight champion Larry Holmes, who was older but albeit still dangerous, and would also score a win against Riddick Bowe in their epic trilogy, which is up there as the greatest trilogies of all time, as well as stepping in with the likes of Lennox Lewis, James Tunney and Nikolai Valuev. Holyfield was an amazing combination puncher who could outbox you on the back foot or outfight you on the front foot. He had incredible heart and was involved in some of the most entertaining fights ever seen. After knocking out James Buster Douglas to win his first heavyweight title, Holyfield would go on to box until his late 40s and be boxing's only 5-time heavyweight champion of the world. A warrior who never ducked anybody and fought some of the greatest punchers in their primes, Holyfield would retire with a record of 44 wins, 10 defeats and 2 draws with 29 knockouts. Smoking Joe Frazier was one of the most relentless and toughest heavyweights in history. A pressure fighter who gave Muhammad Ali his toughest ever fights, Frazier was gifted with one of the most brutal left hooks in the sport's history. As determined as they come, Frazier was a nightmare to fight for most fighters. Unless you had Foreman-like power, he was impossible to get off you. And he would be willing to walk through a hailstorm of punishment in order to just get to you. Once he closed the distance, he would batter you with hooks to both body and head. Frazier would win the heavyweight title in just his 20th professional bout against Buster Mathis Jr., and he would successfully defend it 10 times. During his title reign as heavyweight champion, he would defeat notable names such as Jimmy Ellis, Oscar Bonavena, Bob Foster, Jerry Quarry, but most notably in the fight of the century, Muhammad Ali. Frazier possessed almost unrivaled intensity in that fight, battering Muhammad Ali with brutal hooks and ultimately scoring that iconic left hook knockdown. He also had an extremely effective bob and weave defense that he used with the cross guard and was harder to hit than you would imagine. His brutal trilogy with Muhammad Ali is rated as the greatest in the sport's history, with the fight of the century and the thriller in Manila being the most brutal and intense heavyweight fights ever seen. Amongst his career, Frazier would only lose to the 2 great heavyweights of his era, Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. Every other challenger of that stacked era was swept aside with brutal destruction. Joe Frazier retired with a record of 32 wins, 4 defeats, 1 draw with 27 KOs. Larry Holmes is one of the most underrated heavyweight champions in history. A true champion who dominated the division for 7 years, he had the greatest and most diverse jab in the heavyweight division's history in my opinion, and used it consistently to dominate his opposition and set up the powerful backhand. He also had excellent side-to-side movement, similarly to that of Muhammad Ali who came before him, never-ending stamina and a brilliant boxing IQ. But what always stands out to me about Larry is his freakish powers of recovery. He took so many heavy shots and had so many near disasters as his time as champion. Throughout his reign, in which he made a staggering 20 successful title defences, he was dropped on numerous occasions and severely hurt, looking like he was going to get knocked out. But Holmes always found a way to get up, dig through and find a way to win. He took what I believe is the hardest punch to never knock somebody out against Ernie Shavers, rose off the canvas and still went on to win both fights against Ernie. And his all-time classic against Ken Norton, in which he won the heavyweight title, provided the most exciting and grueling 15th round in boxing history. During his reign as heavyweight champion, Holmes would make 20 consecutive successful title defences, racking his record up to an astonishing 48-0. He would even box into his 50s and would retire with a record of 69 wins to 6 defeats with 44 KOs. Rocky Marciano is the only heavyweight champion in history to retire winning all of his fights. A true American icon of the 1950s, Rocky epitomised hard work, discipline and determination. With a legendary training routine in which he would run at least 5 miles every day of the year, he was one of the most well-conditioned fighters in history, and this really translated into his style. A swarming knockout machine who would throw never-ending power shots with incredible toughness and an iron chin. Despite being the smallest heavyweight champion in history and starting boxing at the late age of 23, he would defeat some all-time greats, all within the span of 7 years. Although his 3-year reign as heavyweight champion was quite short in comparison to other heavyweight legends, Rocky's impact on the sport is colossal. He would defeat the likes of Ezzard Charles twice, Archie Moore and Jersey Joe Walcott twice. He would eventually retire from boxing with a record of 49-0 with 43 knockouts. In his peak, George Foreman was the most terrifying figure to ever step into a boxing ring, a true knockout artist who destroyed world-level opposition consistently. Foreman smashed his way to the heavyweight title, holding a record of 40-0 with 38 knockouts, dropping Joe Frazier 6 times in their fight and demolishing Ken Norton in the second round. After ultimately losing to Muhammad Ali in the most iconic fight of all time, the Rumble in the Jungle, George would bounce back in devastating fashion. His brutal fight with Ron Lyle is amongst the most exciting ever seen in the heavyweight division, and Foreman hit the canvas multiple times, but would ultimately show his heart, toughness to dig through and win by knockout. He would ultimately go on to defeat Joe Frazier by knockout again, before losing to Jimmy Young and retiring at the age of 28. But it would be the success of his comeback against huge odds that would cement him as an all-time legend. A decade later, at the age of 38 years old, George decided to make an unexpected comeback. With a much less threatening physique and a friendlier personality, people didn't take his comeback too seriously until he stepped in with the likes of Tommy Morrison and Evander Holyfield. George proved he was still the real deal in these fights, standing toe-to-toe and taking a lot of punishment against the much younger world-level competition. And at the age of 45 years old, he would achieve the impossible, winning the world heavyweight title against the very good Michael Moore via knockout, becoming the oldest heavyweight champion in boxing history. Lennox Lewis is the last undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. A true all-rounder with excellent IQ, a brilliant jab and lights-out power. Lewis could do it all and he had the resume to match. After winning Olympic gold as an amateur, Lewis would defeat all of the great fighters of a stacked 90s era and claim every heavyweight title. He was able to use his superior boxing IQ and skills to outbox big punchers, but also had a deadly punch that could knock anyone out. He also proved his heart in a slugfest against the great Vitali Klitschko. Some of the biggest wins on his resume include the likes of Evander Holyfield, Mike Tyson, Tommy Morrison, Ray Mercer, Andrew Golota, Vitali Klitschko, David Tua, Frank Bruno, Hasim Rahman, Donovan Ruddock, Shannon Briggs and so many more. He would eventually retire with a record of 41 wins to 2 losses and 1 draw with 32 knockouts, and would defeat everyone he ever faced. Joe Louis is the most dominant heavyweight world champion in history, the longest reigning heavyweight champion too, with the most consecutive title defences during his reign. Louis is a legend. During a time in which racial tensions were extremely high, Louis was the first African American athlete to receive nationwide acclaim. Reigning as the heavyweight champion for just shy of 12 years, Louis would make 25 consecutive title defences. Louis would defeat everyone he ever faced in his first 59 fights, with just one sole defeat to the legendary German Max Schmeling. Louis would avenge that defeat in one of the biggest fights of all time on the eve of World War II via a first round knockout. During his dominant reign, he would defeat the likes of Primo Carnera, Max Baer, Max Schmeling, Jack Sharkey, Billy Conn, Jersey Joe Walcott, amongst dozens of others. Louis was one of the hardest punchers of all time and in many people's eyes reviewed as the best finisher in boxing history. Louis could throw every shot in the book with textbook perfection and had some of the greatest balance you'll ever see, which is one of the reasons he carried so much power and his shots were so accurate. The illustrious Ring magazine have Joe Louis as the greatest puncher in boxing history, which is a testament to his knockout prowess. He would initially retire in his prime with a record of 58-1, but due to financial issues with the IRS, he had to make a comeback. He would eventually retire with a record of 66-3 with 52 big knockouts. Muhammad Ali is not only the most iconic boxer, but the most iconic athlete of all time. A true global superstar who was the entire package, entertaining inside and outside of the ring, Ali has one of the greatest resumes in boxing history. He's the greatest heavyweight of the 1960s and the 1970s, 2 eras stacked with all-time great talent. Outside of the ring he was a juggernaut, with one of the greatest personalities ever seen from a sportsman, and an unbreakable will to stand up for what he truly believed in. Ali inspired so many millions around the world. But he was just as great in the ring as he was outside of it. Ali revolutionised the way heavyweight boxers fought, and no one's been able to replicate it with such success since. There's never been a heavyweight that danced around the ring with such elegance, speed and defensive prowess as him in his prime. And no heavyweight has been able to put combination punches together over 15 rounds like Ali. but he would also possess one of the all-time greatest chins and one of the biggest hearts ever seen in a boxing ring, being involved in so many brutal fights against the sport's all-time hardest punchers and never being knocked out. In his career, he would defeat Floyd Patterson twice, Joe Frazier twice, Ken Norton twice, Henry Cooper twice, Sonny Liston twice, Joe Bugner twice, as well as scoring victories against George Foreman, Ernie Shavers, Jimmy Ellis, Jerry Quarry, Ron Lyle, Jimmy Young, Leon Spinks, and so many others. His fights with Frazier and Foreman are the most famous in the sport's history, and he was banned for 3 years of his prime, meaning we may not have even seen the best of Muhammad Ali. He retired with a